My name is Todd Beck, and I'm a web seminar producer for ACAMS. Welcome to the ACAMS web seminar, Managing an Effective OFAC Compliance Program. Our panel today reads like a who's who in OFAC compliance. Our speakers today are John, who's MasterCard's Global AML and Trade Sanctions Officer. Prior to joining MasterCard, John was a regulatory consultant and forensic investigator for Promontory Financial Group, FTI Consulting, and KPMG, and he has more than 17 years of regulatory and compliance experience. John's experiences include assisting firms with complying with regulatory enforcement actions, such as cease and desist orders and non-prosecution agreements, as well as conducting complex financial fraud investigations, including securities fraud, Ponzi schemes, and money laundering investigations. John holds a BA from the University of Albany and an MBA from Baruch College, and he's CAM certified. Steve joined GE Capital in February 2012 to help lead the design, development, and implementation of GE Capital's global anti-corruption, economic sanctions, and anti-money laundering compliance programs. Prior to GE Capital, he held similar roles at 3 other global financial institutions. He was legal counsel at OFAC and was a military intelligence officer in the U.S. Army at the White House Military Office's Presidential Emergency Operations Center. Clay is Managing Director and the Global Economic Sanctions Executive for Bank of America Corporation, where he's responsible for the company's economic sanctions and anti-boycott compliance efforts. Before commencing this role in 2009, Clay had responsibility for economic sanctions compliance at Merrill Lynch. And from 1999 to 2007, Clay served with OFAC, working first in the Compliance Division and later the International Programs Division, which is now called the Office of Global Targeting. Among his roles while at OFAC, Clay served as the first chief of the Counterproliferation Section, where he led a team of sanctions investigators charged with targeting the assets of weapons of mass destruction proliferators and their support networks. Clay received his BA from George Washington University and an MA from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And our moderator today, Tim, who is an expert on OFAC and sanctions issues and has addressed OFAC and BSA issues at conferences throughout the United States. Tim has published articles in the ABA Bank Compliance Magazine, ACAMS Today, and Western Banking Magazine. We're very pleased that Tim's the current chairperson of ACAMS Sanction Task Force and was a member of ACAMS Certification Exam Task Force. He was a member of the working group formed by the United Nations Al-Qaeda Taliban Sanctions Monitoring Team in 2007. And prior to that, in June 2006, at the request of the U.S. Department of State, Tim addressed an EU-U.S. workshop on financial sanctions and terrorist financing in Vienna, Austria. So like I said, it's an incredible cast today to talk with you. And Tim, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. First of all, I want to thank ACAMS for bringing together this expert panel of sanction experts. And John, Steve, Clay, thanks for joining us today. We have a very large audience. I think it's a validation for both the high level of concern for compliance professionals and what for the sanctions issues, OFAC, and globally in general, as well as the focus of the regulators, the focus that the regulators are placing on sanctions compliance within the financial services companies. Our learning objectives or outcomes today are discussing the various internal and external challenges that these experts face on a daily basis when they manage their OFAC compliance programs. And we have the real benefit today of having 3 different unique perspectives. Credit card company, MasterCard, one of the leaders in the industry, Bank of America, a money center institution with global operations, and specifically we've got Steve coming in from GE Capital that has a broad network of a variety of different companies and services that they provide. Certainly, I think one of the reasons we have a large audience today is because we have seen enforcement actions at record-setting levels for civil monetary penalties. And I think it's important that we recognize and keep in balance the perspective of these enforcement actions as well as the broad-based exam requirements that most of us have from the FFIEC. I want to start off here. Those of us that have been active in OFAC and sanctions over the years are well aware that OFAC has taken a strict liability for its enforcement approach to all of its sanction programs. That being said, the OFAC examiners that are specifically looking at this are actually doing it under the Bank Secrecy Act, and hence are allowing us to take a risk-based approach for our programs. So starting off, Clay, if you could speak to a little bit, maybe from the 20,000-foot level, how your organization addresses its risk-based program and some of the different levels that your organization puts into play since you are so large and complex.
Sure, Tim. Happy to do that. As you mentioned, I mean, we're in an interesting time from an enforcement perspective, right? I mean, we've seen, through various activities, we've seen the penalties and the penalty authority that OFAC has grow over time. And we're certainly seeing, I'd say, relative to 10 years ago, a potentially more active enforcement environment, and certainly a heightened awareness of sanctions issues generally. And so, that does translate into, impact on our program. The program you have today really probably shouldn't look like the program you had 10 years ago. And I think it's also fair to say, coming out of, and it's appropriate timing this week, 5 years after the, really onset in earnest of the financial crisis, I think it is fair to say that the expectations for financial institutions, particularly larger institutions, have probably changed over the years. I think it's fair to say that there's an expectation, particularly of the larger institutions, that we are acting as sort of guardians, if you will, or have an obligation to safeguard the integrity of the financial system. And so it's just a way in which the expectations have risen. And so from our perspective, I think I would say we still do take a risk-based approach when it comes to sanctions. Certainly as a legal matter, OFAC is a strict liability regime, but despite what can sometimes seem like the scary penalties that we've all seen over the past few years out there, I think it's important to remember what OFAC has given us on the positive side of the ledger and look at it as tools that they've given us to do our jobs well. They've spent a lot of time working with our regulators to give us very manageable content in the FFIEC manual that really give you the pillars of the core elements, really, of a sanctions compliance program. So we've certainly built to that. They've given us the enforcement guidelines that give us transparency into what they're thinking in a way that we didn't have a few years ago. And that lets you, benchmark your own program against that. And we certainly do that on an ongoing basis through our risk assessment activities and our ongoing compliance monitoring activities. And every time OFAC does issue a penalty, although you always hope your name isn't on that penalty, that is a learning opportunity for you, right? You get to learn from what others have paid some money for. And candidly, that's part of what OFAC is hoping for. They've given us risk matrices that highlight from their perspective what they deem to be higher risk. So that should logically influence your risk assessment, and the outcome of that risk assessment should logically influence what you test. And that's certainly the case for us. And they've given us really a laundry list of frequently asked questions on their website that again, if we were looking 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, they really weren't there to the degree and extent that they are today. And there's really some good stuff in there too, particularly again if you're a financial institution, or in the case of my bank, a money center bank that's often an intermediary in transactions. There's some good stuff in there that it will help you, figure out how you draw that line when you're acting as an intermediary. How far back do you really, are you really expected to diligence a non-account party? So, from our perspective, I would say we still do have a risk-based approach, but I would say that the risk tolerance is lower than it was, when I started working in sanctions, in the late 90s. I think that's fair to say. And certainly, you feel when you're going through a regulatory exam, and I'm going through several of them at the moment, you feel like the risk tolerance is lower, and it probably should be, right? There's absolutely a lot going on, but so it's I think of it as kind of a learning process, right? I mean, my program is never going to be static. If it is static, I'm probably not doing my job. So you really have to watch what's going on in the environment, listen to what your functional regulators are expressing in terms of their concerns. Sometimes that'll align with OFAC, sometimes it may not. But look at it as your opportunity to leverage the tools and material that you've been given to continue to evolve and grow your program to meet the needs of your institution.
Hey, Tim.
Thanks, Clay.
Tim, this is Steve. I just had one very brief comment on Clay's explanation of the risk-based approach, and that is, as people think about their risk assessment, I do think that there is a particular nuance with respect to a risk assessment around OFAC and OFAC compliance, and that is this risk area is inherently a needle in a haystack searching exercise for most institutions, most business lines, most products. The risk of exposure to an OFAC violation is very, very low, but the consequence is very high, and that's a bit different than many other risk assessments, and it's important to keep that in mind when you think about balancing the controls that you put in place, and that is, inherently the detection of a sanctions violation, it's just low risk, but consequence is so high that you can't ignore it.
Thanks, Steve. One of the things, Steve, I was going to ask you specifically, I know on a couple of cases you've come into play to overhaul, revamp, renew a program. Certainly you're doing that and have done since 2012 at GE Capital. What's your approach when you first walk into a new opportunity like that? I know you spent time at UBS, but with the heightened level of focus on sanctions, where do you start?
Yeah, so I don't know that there is a single right answer to that. Every institution's different. The products are different. Their structure is different. But the most important thing I think to look at is creating a structure so that you get consistency and accuracy in the analysis and instruction on how to handle a true exposure to a risk. And specifically what I mean is you don't want people all over the world on their own trying to analyze how to handle an exposure to OFAC risk. It's incredibly nuanced. The programs are changing. It's very, very important that people with expertise are looking at these exposures, understanding what the requirements are, figuring out how to instruct the business on what to do, and having a central point of contact for that analysis and ultimately for any communication with OFAC. So many places debate whether or not they want to put in place a fully centralized compliance program where all of the alerts are being handled in one center of excellence, one team located in a particular place. Other businesses like to be decentralized so that the analysis is close to the business. I don't know that it really matters one way or the other, but I do think what is most important is that where there is a true exposure to a risk, it goes to a centralized location so that you can ensure that the analysis and instruction is correct, it's consistent, and the communication to OFAC is controlled.
Wonderful. On that same concept of centralization, John, certainly MasterCard is global in nature. Just about everybody's carrying some of the one or two or three or maybe all of the main brands of credit cards in their wallets as they travel globally. Does MasterCard centralize its filtering environments, and can you speak a little bit to how that works?
Sure. It's important to reflect, again, how sometimes complex this area is. Certainly when I joined MasterCard 2 years ago, it was, okay, this is one of the areas that I'm going to focus on. And certainly I think as I've delved deeper into this, and certainly my background was much stronger, I'll say, in the AML side and in the investigation side, but using all those skills that I learned in the AML and investigations and applied it to the OFAC area. When it comes to MasterCard, my background was more on the banking side, but now I've joined a network operator. I've joined a technology company that has lots of new and changing products and services out there. And I think there's a recognition of being, first of all, acknowledging the complexity there. Two, again, looking at sort of what are some of the historical precedents and processes that you have, and again, questioning whether or not they still make sense in today's world, as Clay and Steve have talked about there. And then, for MasterCard, it is looking at sort of what's our framework, what's our approach, and just sort of, set the table here for MasterCard. Our direct customers are the banks themselves, the ones that do the issuing and the acquiring for the merchants. And our responsibility at MasterCard, we first and foremost screen those banks and their officers, owners, and key directors against the OFAC list. Certainly, we cannot have anyone that's on the OFAC list being a licensed MasterCard issuer or acquirer. That, in addition to that, from a network perspective, we do have network blocks in place for those countries that are subject to the comprehensive sanctions: Sudan, Syria, Iran, North Korea, and Cuba. And certainly we and our network have blocks in place to prevent transactions with those countries. In addition, from our, like I mentioned there, the licensing efforts, we don't license banks in those countries as well, so we kind of check off on one another. But the additional aspect of that is for MasterCard, we do require our issuers and acquirers to screen their cardholders and their merchants against the SDN list as well, and we do make that as a requirement within our participation in our network. Being in we operate in retail payments, which the purpose of what we do, and it's a low value, doesn't lend itself well to having screening, because that slows it down. And certainly you don't want someone sitting at the supermarket checkout waiting for a filtering to be done and an alerting process to be done. It doesn't lend itself to that. We're not in the wholesale payments correspondent banking area. So again, we take I think a slightly different approach to that. I think that's consistent with the risk-based approach that we've talked about there. And certainly I think for us, we're making sure that all those obligations are communicated out there. And I think the one last thing, to talk about, we do talk about sort of communicating that sanctions risk to senior management. And one of the first things we did here, we did look at it, and I'll ask the audience, is sanctions part of your AML message? And I would ask everyone to sort of pause and take a look if that's the right approach. Sanctions and AML are separate and distinct risk, and so you want to make sure you're not confusing or muddling the message on those risks to your senior management. And so talking about risk assessments, having a separate one for sanctions, and make sure it's not subsumed within your sort of your AML framework. So I think that those are all valuable lessons that I certainly have brought forward in my time here at MasterCard.
John, thank you very much. For those of you in the banking sector, great words of wisdom. If you've ever been wondering, what do I do to speak to the credit card risk for your portfolio to your regulators? It is a part of your product set. How is it being addressed? John's just outlined that for us very well. Steve, briefly, touch upon how do you reach out to your senior management, and how do you go the other direction of making sure your broad base is well trained on OFAC and other sanctions?
So when I think about training, I tend to think about it in three different levels. At the most basic, you've got people in your organization who are responsible for exercising certain control processes. They obviously need to be trained on the details of the requirements, what it is they are trying to accomplish, and they actually need to understand a great deal about the regulations and how to ensure that the control processes are well targeted and effective against the regulatory requirements. But those are for the people who are really involved in the process itself of implementing those controls. For most of the population, the audience that you need to train, what's most important is that they understand what a sanctions risk would look like and how to escalate that to someone who can help them. They don't need to become experts in the distinction between blocking versus rejecting. They don't really need to know the distinction between the Iran program and the Cuba program. What they need to know is some pretty basic concepts and terms, so that if they see any potential exposure, they know who to send that to get guidance and advice. For senior management, it's important that they understand this risk area, the consequences, and I think most fundamentally, the root causes of failures within an organization. Not the specifics about a particular enforcement action, but what are the human behaviors that underlie the root causes that led to the compliance failure. And they need to understand how to assign resources against those types of root causes, those behavioral causes. So again, I think it's often a mistake to try to train people by flashing up a bunch of specific enforcement actions and talk about the specifics of those cases, because everyone's different, and it'll become too easy for people to distinguish themselves from the details of a particular enforcement action. But there will be underlying traits of human behavior around how people can ignore certain areas of risk, or believe because everyone seems to be doing this particular activity, it must be permissible, or thinking, hey, we've been doing this long enough, so therefore there must not be any problem with it. Those types of root causes are the things that I think it's important to get people to focus on.
Wonderful. And to wrap up the internal challenges, Clay, wanted to go to you and talk a little bit about how you're staying proactive, with your product folks, so that your folks have a say in, identifying what the risk would be of a launch for, say, a new mobile banking product, or whether it's we're going to take RDC overseas, those types of issues. How do you get that ear at the table that's so important to let everybody know right up front we need to have a sanctions perspective when we roll anything out?
Sure. No, that's an excellent point, because nothing will look worse for you, right? If you roll out a product and then have to pull it back, or delay an implementation because you're getting close to that magical line where bad things will begin to happen. So there's a couple of ways to address it. First and foremost, you've got your policy or your program where you can define standards, and that's what we've done at our institution. There's clear sort of guidelines at a policy level that kind of set the framework for what needs to be considered when a new product or service is offered. And so we do that from the sanctions side, but then that can feed into the broader, new business review sort of activities of your firm. And certainly we're one of many risks that need to be considered when you're evaluating a new product. We leverage that. We also, because, we can't, sanctions resources, even at a bank of our size, are not infinite. And I, just logistically cannot have necessarily someone on my team in every product discussion going on across the enterprise. But you do have other compliance and risk partners and control function partners across the enterprise whose job it is to be there. And so those are the people you want to know. Those are the people, to Steve's point, that maybe need that heightened sense of training or that heightened sense of awareness from more detailed training for issue spotting that's maybe a little bit more tailored to the function. So we certainly do leverage, partner organizations in that sense. And then it also feeds back in, I think, nicely to the discussion that we just had over engagement of senior management. Because if you really look at this, and again, sanctions is just one of many risks that need to be considered, you need to find a way to articulate it as a cost you want to know up front, right? You don't want to go roll out a product where the margin, is so small that the cost of compliance, what you need to build in your control environment to control the risk that you've assessed, outweighs whatever you're going to make on it, right? No businessman is going to want to do that. And so if you can have that conversation and explain that, look, guys, I'm going to help you, have a realistic target for deployment. You're not going to have surprises from me, and you're going to know what you need to build up front so you don't have to build it later and turn, a low margin product into an unprofitable one. Then I think you can start to have that resonance. And if you can get that buy-in from senior management to reinforce the message so that they, say, look, did we cover our risks, including sanctions? Then I think you've got a good model there. And the success can feed on itself over time. And, the one bad one, it sounds terrible, but the one bad one sometimes bad in the sense that you had to delay or pull back rather than, you get whacked.
Elements, certainly, your policies and the priorities and the lessons learned from enforcement is so important. And rather than pick on each individual enforcement action, wanted to speak to some of the broad-based external challenges that influence everybody's programs. And I just wanted to start off, what's really the influence of the HSBC and the permanent subcommittee hearings on that and the pressure on the regulators? And I'd like to start off with you again, Clay, kind of say, how do you put that into perspective of the overall pressure you're likely to see from your regulators as a result of this?
Sure. Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, I think it's fair to say that there's certainly a heightened awareness of sanctions issues today, relative to where we were a few years ago. And certainly, some of the very public activities that we've seen, including the PSI hearings last summer, can feed into that awareness. And certainly where your functional regulator may, rightly or wrongly feel that they are under greater scrutiny themselves, you're going to feel that, trickle down into your exams, undoubtedly. And certainly I feel like I experience that quite frequently, and I'm sure others on the phone do too. But I think, again, it's even though the expectations, particularly of a larger financial institution, from my perspective, may have changed, and people expect me to be better than I was yesterday or last year. Again, I think it's important not to lose perspective. Go back to the basics of, what do I do as a business? What is, the inherent risk there? And do these external factors move the needle on that inherent risk. And so if they do, what do I need to do, trying to detach sometimes from the emotion that comes with a heated exam, or discussion with your examiners. What do I need to do to place my institution in the best position to be compliant, given that changed level of risk? And so I think, again, that perception, you have to be ready to manage it, and you may disagree with the perception at times, and so if you're going to go into a discussion, and we've had a few of these ourselves over here at our bank, where you're going to sort of push back against a perception, you need to be very fact-based. I think it, again, raises the bar on me to be able to prove my case. I need data to back up my position. If I think something, is on the low risk end of the spectrum, but maybe an auditor, an examiner doesn't agree, you need to have that informed discussion, and be prepared to explain with facts to back it up why. Now you may not prevail, but you want to give it your best shot, and again, you sometimes just need that moment to take the deep breath and get some perspective. These things are ever changing. They always will be. That's part of the joy of sanctions, right? It's always going to be a different thing. It's not static. And I think if you kind of look at it through that framework, and understand the pressures that your functional regulators candidly are under right now,
right.
It helps you manage through it.
And Clay, you bring out a very valid point there. It is not static. For those of you that have, maybe been thrown into sanctions recently, the Permanent Senate Investigative Committee hearings, this is not the first time around. I mean, this thing reared its head back in the late 90s on the exposure for money laundering through the correspondent banking network, laid some of the foundation for the original Patriot Act clauses. It's here to stay, and I think it's, I would ask Steve to comment on this. It's a constant. The bar continues to get pushed as there's government oversight for these particular issues. And Steve, what does that mean for your program?
So the dynamic nature of economic sanctions requires you to think about your program in a couple of specific ways. First, you have to recognize that sanctions are designed to implement a foreign policy objective, which means that policy can change, and it can change abruptly. It is part of a political process. It usually involves external watchdog groups, and increasingly is done in the context of multinational cooperation. Those external dynamics are fascinating to watch, but they all suggest that you have to be ready to evolve very quickly. Any one of those factors can influence the requirements or the expectations or the underlying nature of the risk itself. So you have to pay attention to what's happening in the external environment because it all informs how you are going to put in place detective preventative controls and how you're going to think about your risks. So point one, you can't do it based solely on just trying to follow the narrow, specific regulatory requirements, because there's so much going on in the external environment which is going to suggest how you have to think about the risk.
Steve,
the other thing.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say the other part of the program that I think you have to keep in mind is because these things change, they change often in very subtle ways. So in particular, there could be a change in a long-standing general license, or a change in an interpretation, or a change in the definition. And you have to be able to pick those out and understand what that actually means. So, for instance, in the Iran program, it used to be prohibited to provide services to a person located in Iran. And that was changed now to persons subject to Iranian jurisdiction. So you have to be able to detect those changes and variations, but then you have to figure out what does that actually mean, and does that impact the structure of your detective and preventative controls.
Steve, I'd like you to segue from there into that third bullet point. I mean, the complexity of these sanction programs, just continue to become more interwoven. And I've highlighted here certainly those that are directly focused at Iran and their efforts for the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. In a couple of minutes, describe to me, how do you go to your executives and say, these things are interwoven? What does SASADA mean as it relates to previous Iranian sanction programs? When somebody gets a hit, how do you go through that pecking order of all the different programs to know where is it really implicated? So help us with that.
Yeah. So for when I'm talking to senior management or I'm talking to the business leaders, I don't try to teach them the difference between SASADA or the ITR or other acronyms of the OFAC program. They're not going to keep it straight, and it really doesn't matter. But what does matter to them is when there is a change in the program that requires us to do something different or put in place a new control or exposes us to a new risk, they have to understand what those changes are. So, for instance, being able to understand that under the Iran, the changes to the Iran Sanctions Act, our non-U.S. subsidiaries now have to have processes to ensure that they comply with the U.S. sanctions against Iran. That's a change, and that's a fundamental new exposure to sanctions risk that impacts the way we think about the risk and the specific controls that we put in place. So when I'm talking to senior management, they need to understand how we are exposed to risk and what it actually looks like and what we're doing about it. Now, the complexity, being able to stay on top of all of the nuances and changes and all the different acronyms, that's where you have to hire and build expertise in hubs in your business who can stay on top of this and who can understand these nuances, understand the subtle distinctions and differences, and then appreciate how those differences impact a particular control or a process, and be able to implement those changes and train the specific individuals who have to implement the control process. One key way to try to figure that out, though, is to the extent that it produces a publication in the Federal Register, read the preambles very closely. Preambles to anything in the Federal Register really set out why the change is being made, the source of law, how it's being implemented, and gives you a lot of insight that if you just went to the regulations or just went to the text of the law, you would miss.
Great advice there, Steve. And I'm going to reach out to John here. With what Steve has just told us about the complexities of the nuances and, having the expertise in place to address all these different aspects of the changing world of sanctions and licenses, John, how do you communicate that to your IT staff to make sure that they're tweaking those filters, that they're putting pieces into play that will be able to address the enhanced risk, or maybe allowing you to do transactions and open a market sector that you haven't been able to before because of the sanctions? Can you speak to that communication? I've always heard of the silos between the IT side that runs the filter and the compliance expertise. How do you get over that hurdle?
Well, I think the first thing you got to acknowledge that it is complex. We're a company that's been built up over 45 years of different technology services. So I think going in with sort of a very simplistic thought in your mind that it's just as simple as flicking a switch won't get you anywhere, especially in talking to the IT staff. I think, first off, we've always, I think, tried to help. It's interesting. Every time we started a conversation with folks that are in the IT world, it's always with us first explaining why we're talking to them and what this area is. And that has actually translated a bit into the training efforts that we do for our various IT groups. And where we've found it to be most effective is, one, first, and I agree with Steve, we don't talk in all the different acronyms, but to really simplify it for them to understand what is our role, what is the importance of this, and then to actually pull together some hypotheticals and walk them through how the hypotheticals actually affect MasterCard. And really that speaks volumes to having each one of those people understand what we're talking about. From there, we've actually done a lot of work with having them understand what type of processes they need to have so that when a comprehensive sanctions does go into place, that they are able to react very quickly. It is also important for us to understand what those limitations are. Is there a certain refresh cycle that our systems work off of? What systems actually talk to one another? What systems are separate? And that actually has informed a bit of our strategy. I think originally, when you think about sort of implementing certain sanctions actions, you think of it as sort of a cascading effect, and it'll work its way down. What we've recognized, at least for our company, the way it's structured, the way it operates, we really have taken more of a hub and spoke approach, where we in compliance are sort of at the center to work with each of the individual groups as they implement whatever action needs to be taken. That puts a little bit more on us, but allows us to have, I think, a lot more confidence that what we need to happen is actually going to take place, because we've already gone through the training, we've made them aware, we've worked with each of these teams as to the procedures, we've actually detailed what they need to do in terms of a checklist, what type of verification steps we're going to do after the fact, how often that verification happens, and we've actually gone as far down as to what procedures will take place when we want to reverse this. I think a perfect example a couple of years ago was the speed of which the Libyan sanctions came into place and then actually got reversed out. So you need to have kind of the full life cycle in mind as you kind of go through that discussions with your IT groups. Another thing to also take into mind is look at those enforcement actions. I think Clay and Steve have talked about it. Every single one of the enforcement actions, and if you even go through the ones that have been just published since June, I think all but two, in my mind, have a message from OFAC in there. They do talk about a certain process that they want everyone in the industry to look at. They talk about procedures. Are you using date of birth in your screening? Have you, in your procedures, discussions of reporting timelines? So there are, in each one of those enforcement actions, a very valuable message that is coming from enforcement. And I think lastly, what I'll leave you with is we talk about the PSI here, and certainly we talk about the long history they've had in this area. But it's also recognition that a lot of that was driven by Senator Levin. And Senator Levin will be retiring. I think his term ends at the end of next year. And so it's unclear as to whether PSI will still continue to have that role in this area going forward after Senator Levin leaves, or will there be another enforcement agency, congressional arm, or such that will take up that role? And I think that's yet to be seen, and it is important to kind of keep your fingers on the pulse of what's going on around that world.
Thanks, John. The highlight on some of those enforcement actions we're going to get to here at a later slide, but quickly, Clay, if you could jump in and speak to, the complex matrices of risk and risk assessment and mitigating factors and, certainly in external challenges, how do you communicate to that examiner that this risk assessment is where it should be, and the ever importance of, is it increasing in this sector, is it decreasing in this sector, and how are you explaining to the regulator that you're focused on this area versus that area? Can you, a couple of minutes on that for us?
Sure, yeah. How do you communicate that to a regulator? Well, how do you communicate
How do you communicate this to the audience in 2 minutes is hard enough, right?
It's, again, for all the reasons that have been discussed, it's, you really, it's got to be fact-based in my view. You have to know how your business works. So in addition to appreciating and understanding and applying the nuance of the sanctions themselves, you've got to have that level of understanding of the business. Speaking from our experience here, and again, there's no one size fits all here. We've actually, over the past few years, moved away from what I would say was more of a quantitative model of risk assessment to one that incorporates a lot more qualitative attributes. And what I mean by that is those things which are not easily assigned numbers or colors. At least at Bank of America, we like to color everything, on charts. And so what we've tried to do with our risk assessment, while not losing the quantitative measures that you do have in terms of, of volumes of payments or volumes of alerts or ratios of hit rates to what you actually block, and audit issues and the like, but to really move in, to add more qualitative of, why does that number matter? How does that, how do these facts, speak to the actual residual risk that's left on the table? And what we're finding, and again, I think it's all sort of a learning process here, and each examiner is going to be different. But as we've been able to move into this more qualitative model and a more narrative description of our inherent risk, a more narrative description of our controls, in addition to all the quantitative stuff you can back it up with, you're able to have a little bit more of a conversation. And so, for example, what I tend to do is when an examiner asks me a question in the context of an exam, I'm going to put it in writing, or typically they'll give it to me in writing, and then I will formulate a written response, right, that allows me to put the data forward that I think supports my view. But then I deliver that in a conversation. We sit down, ideally face-to-face, and we talk about it. And I, at least personally, I've found that having that ability to have that back and forth about the risk has been far more convincing to my auditors internally as well as my examiners than I think sort of, the trap you can fall into where you just, fire off an email or, you don't put a lot of context around, the quantitative, the numbers in an assessment. That's sort of, I guess, at a high level, what I would say, I've found to be more productive is having that ability to converse about the nuance and explain why you've made the judgment that you've made. And when you have that, I think you can communicate the complexities a little bit more readily than just saying, the risk rating is 4. But that's my take on it.
And Tim, I just wanted to make a quick comment on that, which I think that's ultimately the key, because frequently you will be asked, what do we need to do to manage our OFAC risk? And it's not as simple as turning to a set of regulations that say you must do the following type of screening. You must ensure that you're screening your employees. You must ensure that you're screening IP addresses. There's no regulation that says you have to do that. So you have to think through the nuances of how would we be exposed to a sanctions risk in our particular business. What would that look like? How would it evidence itself? And therefore, what can we do to try to screen for that, detect that, identify that particular risk in an operational setting? And it gets exactly to what Clay was saying is, you have to think through those nuances in order to explain why you do what it is you need to do to manage that risk. Because you can't just point to a book and say, well, I'm told I have to screen employees, therefore I'm screening employees. There was a question I saw as to whether or not banks are doing OFAC screens on their employees. My own perspective is in the U.S., I believe many institutions are screening employees both at time of hire and at some periodic interval. I don't know if I don't. Again, there's no rule that says you have to do that. It would be based on your risk assessment.
Great, thanks, Steve. Hey, in the interest of time, I want to pick up this slide here and move on into some other elements that I think are very beneficial. OFAC and the financial services industry. Folks that have been in this industry, you all well recognize the efforts that OFAC is putting forth as far as improving their website, giving you the links to the guidance, the regulations, the lists. They've built a tool out there that you can do your own lookups on, sponsoring free seminars, the symposiums they've had in D.C. every spring for the last 3 years. Great programs. I think OFAC has done an excellent job of stepping up to the challenges in this day and age of a regulatory environment and regulatory scrutiny. The question here, why is there mystique around, OFAC? I think the more you interact, the more you read on their website, that mystique gets broken down. Guys, a minute or two, you want to comment on, this overall, you can't get to OFAC concept? No.
Well, I'll go first. I think, and again, maybe I'm jaded having been there, right? I like to think I was accessible, but I think probably the biggest factor from my perspective that still drives the you can't get to OFAC, it's this mysterious place view is the fact that it is fundamentally still a small agency,
right?
Right. A small agency with a tremendously large mission. And try as they might to get to every question in every case that comes in a expeditious manner, they're just not going to be able to. And they haven't always been the best with public guidance. I think they're a lot better now than they were. But I think that's what drives it. But to your point, particularly again speaking from the financial institution side. You'll find you're dealing often with the same set of people over time if you have frequent dealings with OFAC, and use that as your way into the agency. Listen to what they're telling you when they say, even in an administrative subpoena, here's your contact if you have questions. They're offering it for a reason. Take them up on it. If you got a question, call them and ask. I've found that they're very responsive, even though I'm not real pleased to have that administrative subpoena, that 602, they answer. So that's my take. I don't know if Steve or John have points they'd like to add.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. The only other point that I tell my people frequently when they're looking for a license or some sort of discretionary action is to remind them that not only is it a small agency, like any other organization, they have to prioritize their work, and they're often dealing with issues that involve safety, health, some emergency, some exigency, and if we just have a commercial request, it's going to take longer. They are small and they do have to prioritize, so you have to build that into your process and your expectation. I think the other thing that I would say is it often seems mysterious because many organizations really don't have to deal with OFAC on a frequent basis. You deal with them so infrequently that when you do have to reach out, you just don't really know where to go. If you're in that position, often the best thing to do is reach out to a colleague in the industry who does deal with them on a frequent basis. They can give you some pretty good insight as to how to direct it and how to engage with them in the right way. But to Clay's point, they do try to be as responsive as they can. I've my own experience is when you give them a call, they may not be able to get back to you the same day, but I don't know that I've called the hotline and never had a return call at some point in the relatively near future.
Great. To pick up this next slide, OFAC and the other regulatory agencies, I think there's a hyped up issue here where a lot of the industry is thinking that it's piling on. I think it's important that our audience be well aware of the legal agreements between the FFIC regulators and their reporting and disclosures back to OFAC and vice versa. I think we're all aware why DOJ has stepped in and taken some of the bigger cases and led with that. Certainly, the department in New York, the New York Department of Financial Services has gotten a lot of headlines with their stepping in and putting additional penalties, threatening charters, and so forth. I don't know. Anybody want to comment on that? To me, it is what it is. It's something that is put out there to push for remedial action, and the only way to do it against a major money center is to hit them hard in the pocket or threaten a charter. Anybody want to touch that?
I'd be happy.
I guess. Oh, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I would just, again, I think if we kind of look at the history here, Clay had talked about we're 5 years after the financial crisis. Certainly there is I'll say a political aspect to a lot of that. There is the public sentiment against the industry itself. And so I think it's very important that we don't extrapolate and say that this is where the path that's going forward here. I think certainly when you look at your own organization, when you think about what is the different regulators and the different folks that can be involved, you also got to look at the activity. Are you confident the activity that is in question is that you're confident that you did to the best of your ability to restrict it? What was the impact overall on sanctions itself? So I think sort of you have to take that balanced approach. You can't always be worried about sort of what's going to come in from left field. Certainly, I think from your compliance perspective, you really need to, I think what we talked about before, from risk assessments to senior management communications to the board of directors and the CEO, to have them understand what the true risk is, what you're doing to control it. And I think someone had asked the question, what do we do to sort of make sure that the cross-functional coordination? I think you need to be very clear as a compliance officer what the risk is, how you're controlling for it, and then ultimately, do you have the right resources, the right structure, and what's inhibiting you from accomplishing your goals? And you got to make sure that the appropriate senior management, if that is the CEO and the board, are aware of that and have provided you with what you need to accomplish your function, your risk mitigation, and the protection of the company itself.
Great. Thanks, John. I kind of feel like I'm the newscaster here, but 45 seconds or less, if each of you could throw out a bullet point or a lesson learned from an enforcement action that you've seen. That being the case, Clay, recent enforcement actions, what have you learned?
I think what I'd say is not to pick on anyone in particular, but I would just say you need situational awareness if that's the best way to describe it. What impact does what can you learn from it, and what do all the actors that are out there, the different agencies, what is their role? How do they relate to what you do, so that you understand who you may need to face off with? So just know the environment, know the actors.
Steve?
Pay attention to the reputational risk and don't focus so specifically on the nuances of the regulatory risk. So you ask the question, it may be technically legal, but is it right? And what are the consequences if the environment changes and the regulations change on us?
John?
I think the one that spoke to me a little bit, ironically enough, is the ATP one, where they received the warning letter and still continue to do payments. I think that kind of speaks to me sort of where information can reside in the organization. I think Steve talked about before. They don't need to be experts in this area. However, they need to recognize the key words and the key items that should be flagged to our respective situation. So to me, that's sort of where I want to make sure within my organization that they're not the OFAC expert. However, when something comes up, they know who to flag down and bring it to our attention as quickly as possible.
Wonderful. And I'd ended up with these enforcement actions when you see huge civil monetary penalties because of egregious violations. When you see we've missed this one or the impact to the sanctions program is minor, the enforcement action comes out with kind of a lesson to be learned from this, and how do you correct that moving forward, not the heavy, heavy hand that we all fear. So we're out of time here today. We do have a lot of questions in the queue, and ACAMS will get to those, but folks, I want to just thank you all for attending today, and my expert panelists, great job, and wish you all well in a safe compliance program.
Hey, Tim, John, Steve, Clay, thank you very much. It was interesting for the audience to know before we started today, we were talking and somebody made the comment that it would be interesting to get this group together for lunch and just, have that conversation and hear about it. And as I was listening today, I realized, especially for many on the East Coast, that's exactly what's going on. They were having a lunch conversation with you, as were you guys, except you didn't get to eat. So food always makes things better. We will be done here and send you off to lunch. But thank you very much for being here. It was a great lesson, great conversation, lots of good information. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. If you have additional questions for today's experts or if you have suggestions for future web seminars, we hope you'll send those to that address you see there on the screen, training@acams.org.